What?
Once again, where do you go from there? Go ahead.
Well, look. So here's the thing. What you're mistaking is that you can only do so much with a giant monkey versus a gigantic dinosaur named Godzilla. Uh, what instead you should do is you should build out an entire story where you go into Hollow Earth, because of course Hollow Earth is another dimension inside the Earth with portals all over the place, which is where these giant creatures come from. And there's a gigantic, like, Planet of the Apes style fucking internal beef inside of the monkey area of Hollow Earth. And Kong is like the good guy ape, but there's like the bad guy ape who's like ruling over and brutal, and he's got to stop. Kong has to stop this guy who's going to freeze the world and cause a second ice age with another Godzilla. But this Godzilla shoots ice out of its mouth, not fire. And of course that happens. And duh.
Well, the ice thing's actually cool, but I just think it's a misnomer, man. Don't call it Kong versus Godzilla if there's not a heavyweight champion. Why don't you call it like the League of Monsters or
I mean, they
some
didn't
quasi
they? I think they
Superman
did
nonsense?
that. They did that.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah, the was it King of Monsters was one of them.
No, no, they can't be king if they're not fighting against each other.
I think
Sounds like they're teaming up.
yeah, it's King of Monsters, Legacy of Monsters, and this is, I believe this one is Kong versus Godzilla, New Empire. I'm not sure
Is
though.
that the one that strikes back?
Um, no, that's the monkeys fighting again. Remember, I told you the monkeys, the giant monkeys. They're Kong size. Like, come on, how are you not following me
Yeah.
on this?
I'm following.
Literally,
I just
it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. I made the joke on Twitter that it's the perfect film for people who found Transformers to be too much filled with subtext. Like
oh wow,
it's
that's saying something.
it is just one of the most embarrassing things I've ever watched. Like, and I say that because one of the writers I consider to
You,
be a friend. So, um,
you,
and he's
you
got
didn't feel.
phenomenal taste in movies, and he's written and directed some very good movies, like movies I really like. And I'm just like, Simon, what are you doing? Like,
You,
and I'm sure
you didn't.
it's one of those. There's this old joke that the guys who write the writers for CSI and everything. That they know how stupid the show is, and so they're always writing like they're just having fun writing it because it's a good paycheck and their goal is to be entertaining. And so that's what I'm telling myself here, because it makes sense that it's as dumb as it is because it's just over the top fun. But like, Simon is a very bright guy and a very good writer who I genuinely like his taste in film. Um, and so it was a little heartbreaking, but also fine. Like, I shouldn't say that. Like, it's just weird to watch a movie that, like, the person who did it, it's such a piece of trash film. It's an utter garbage film in ways it's hard for me to even describe.
It's like beneath him,
I mean, no, it's like one of his
or
best friends
a,
is like
a
the
waste of his talent,
one of
right?
his best friends is like the director. So, and then Adam Wingard, who did like a bunch of other films. Like, again, paychecks are paychecks, work is work, and sometimes things are just fun. I get it, but
But
Jesus fucking Christ.
there's just one thing about it. You don't feel Transformers is subtle, like Shia LaBeouf's eBay handle being
Mm.
ladies' man, despite his clear
Yeah. Ha
deprivation of
ha ha
ladies
ha.
to his manhood. You
Ha
didn't
ha
find
ha
that was a
ha ha.
subtle, very cleverly done conceit.
No. Not at the top of my list, that's for sure. Um, I had us at 205, but I'm not sure. Did we make it that far?
Um, did we do the magic triangle?
Did we? We may not have.
Rich, you read two paragraphs and then we kind of just like stopped.
No, we talked
Um,
through it. I think I did do the magic triangle. Um,
I think you read that in the previous paragraph and then we
yeah,
kind of like broke.
because it kind of goes into a new point at this point. Because um, also, hello, Lily and J.K. Apologies that you walked in on us discussing terrible films instead of Anti-Oedipus. Um, but welcome.
Not a problem. I needed the time to settle in, and you didn't need to hear me doing that. So, yeah.
Fair enough. A short version. I'm not recommending anyone go see Kong versus Godzilla: New Empire.
Okay.
That's just a short save. You save a couple bucks. Yeah. Go see something else. All right. Recentering myself in this. I believe we've made our way through and we're on 205 midway because we're moving into a new point. We've talked about this magic triangle that has sort of operated and how it begins to shift. The connotation system, the system of cruelty, into a new system, a system of superiority, of subjugation of one to another. Whereas prior in the earth, the way that the inscription or symbols worked is they were always kind of in an active communication. There was no direct singular meaning inside of these things. The tattoos or scratches on the ground or even sounds or voice, there wasn't ever really a hard meaning. Instead, meaning was connotative. It was shifting and sort of contingent. As we move into this new system of inscription, the discussion they're wanting us to have is to make our way from that system of connotation to instead a power struggle, where suddenly we make a different move with the new despotic machine and imperial representation. And this move is important because as we start seeing some of these power elements take place inside of this, what we're going to start to notice is a few of more parts of the machine that start fucking with us and start moving into a place where capital is able to emerge, and of course Oedipus along with that. So this is the transition that we're kind of in the middle of. We stopped with the discussion of the Earth last week and them sort of putting a fine point on it. We can, I think, revisiting that paragraph for a few minutes is not the worst idea that we could ever have. But what I would say is an even better idea is to be aware that we're making that move into the new socius and the discussion of it. Does that make sense to everyone as I'm saying it? Excellent, Lily. Jack, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'm not as sure about. I don't know if the despotic is like the emergence of power for the first time,
It's
but I do.
subordination, for sure.
Well, it's tricky, but I do recall this
Political
is like
power specifically. I should be exact with it. I know you require that. Specifically, it's an unabashed political power, or the subjugation of one to another, versus the connotation or the mobile blocks of debt that can sort of shift and change meaning constantly. But please go ahead. I'm just being
well,
to be more specific.
yeah,
You're right.
well, no, I think it's worth considering because remember, like the political and the economic are the alliance, right? And that does two things in the primitive, one of which is the repressing, right? So the actual repressive kind of force is the economic and the political, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do get where you're coming from too, because they're going to go into savoir, I think is the French term shortly. So they do have, they do engage the power conversation more directly too. But I think it's tricky in terms of like understanding how power shifts between the two socii, as opposed to like, the question of kind of like what is the origin of power.
Fair. I think here they're making a move very specifically, though, around how images are created. And because this is the line they're ultimately going to be making the move into capital with. So when we talk about in this previous paragraph, the magic triangle with three sides: voice, audition, graphism, body, eye, pain. This system of three things is an order of connotation where the word has a designating function, but the graphism constitutes a sign in conjunction with the thing designated, where the eye goes from one to another, extracting and measuring visibility of one against pain of the other. There's specifically here, this move keeps these elements independent. So maybe power might be me overstepping my bounds. It's fair. But it's that these three elements are independent but connotating. They're in line with each other, and they're their value or meaning shifts based on their sort of context. Versus as we move into the next step, where we have now, because the imperial system, the empire at large, is simply too large to govern everything in person, the state begins to do its work by written decree. This written decree shifts how inscription necessarily works. It places voice above, but underneath. Like, there's this interesting interplay they're talking about, because writing basically becomes this dominant thing in practice, with the voice seemingly above it, but ultimately, by subordinating itself, writing becomes the center of power. It's where the element, sort of the power of things, comes from. The subordination of writing to voice creates the power in writing. And this shift is the push towards the subjugation of one to the other. And it changes drastically how we sort of have the meaning generation or creation of the alliant and the filiative play.
Yeah, and the alliant and the filiative, that's definitely, to me, that's the direct states, because what that is, right, is the first and second syntheses. So I mean, to your point, like, I certainly don't mean to take power off the table either. Like, it's going to become explicitly discussed in this section, I believe. At the same time, like, what's kind of shifting here in a way is, like, territoriality and, in a sense, like, I mean, they're talking about all three syntheses at once here, so it's really tricky. But one of the things that's going on here, right, is they're distinguishing how, like, the territoriality itself is going to shift from the theater of cruelty to, I think it's the system of terror, they call it, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, to that point, right, like, the actual functionality of subjectivity is shifting here, but it's being done with a respect to how the second synthesis changes between the socii, right? Because what the despotic is going to be able to do is misuse the second synthesis,
Right.
whereas the primitive would be kind of more focused on misusing the first synthesis.
Yes, and misusing is, I understand what you're saying. It's the paralogism of the first versus the second. Misusing, misappropriating, I think, maybe. Also, it's a tough wording, because I don't want to add too much language to that, but it's spot on. It's as I've said before, and I'll say
finger waggy, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's one of those things that I want to make sure, as I like to say, the book is not, even though it's called Anti-Oedipus, the book may focus on Oedipus, but it's not only about Oedipus. Oedipus is being used as this example of how elements and repression formed over time, through time, how representation works, how these elements work together. And it's why they're focusing on incest and Oedipus, because it's such an extremely good example of how through time we sort of have morphed meanings, we've reapplied things over time, blah, blah, blah. And so the line I'm going to reread, and then we'll move into the paragraph. If incest seemed impossible to us from this point of view, it is because incest is nothing other than a jump that necessarily fails. This jump, remember the jumping of the eye, this jump that goes from appellations to persons, names to bodies. On the one hand, the repressed this side of appellations that do not yet designate persons, but only intensive germinal states. On the other hand, the repressing beyond that only applies appellations to persons, by prohibiting persons who answer to the names of sister, mother, father. This is a shift that they're talking about. This break, again, because the connotative system of writing, voice, and cruelty of the eye, they never designate hard line. This is mom. This is that. And it's really harsh. Instead, it's very connotative. It's very much contingent on the moment and the context. That puts it in a place where the repressing element doesn't really exist. It's more this after image, because again, the repressed this side of appellations do not designate persons, but only intensive germinal states. The prohibition isn't a positive, no, don't fuck your family. Instead, it's sort of a passive, hey, fuck other people than your family. But this creates this after image that sort of, again, there isn't hardline states, there isn't hardline names for people. None of this stuff exists in that way. We need to find something that does that. Between the two, the shallow stream where nothing passes, where the appellations do not adhere to persons, where persons elude graphic action, where the eye no longer has anything to see or evaluate. Incest, the simple displaced limit, neither repressed nor repressing, but merely the displaced represented of desire. From this moment on, it appears indeed that the two dimensions of representation, its surface organization with the elements voice, graphy, eye, and its in-depth organization with the represented instances of desire repressing, representation displaced represented, share the same fate, like a system of correspondences in the heart of a given social machine. They're talking through how the repression begins to form and how it works in this instance. But now we're shifting to a new place. It's no longer voice, graphy, eye, this context of these elements and this sort of after image. Now there's the voice is sort of in place and tied to the written word. And the written word is particularizing people. The written word is saying, this is mom, which changes everything. And that's what this next paragraph is about, which I'm just going to, I think, dive straight into, unless anyone has an objection. Excellent. Oh, go for it.
I'd like to add to that. So, like, so this part about, like, incest seeming impossible because it's a jump, right? So, like, as I read it, the focus is mainly on what they talked about in a few sections ago between the intensive and the extensive, as it pertains to the disjunction, right? So incest is like the limit between the intensive and the extensive, which is another way of talking about how the socius is going to fall back on production. Because what it's doing, right, is it's basically kind of going from the ambivalent and the intensive, where I believe it's a little bit more like it's plus or minus, but it's not a hard line. It's plus or minus in that kind of inclusive sense, right? Whereas when it extends, this is where you have the alliant taking on a little bit more of like a repressive role too. It's going to be a little bit harder line of this or that kind of horizontal use, right?
Yes.
So like, as I read it, is because incest is nothing other than a jump that necessarily fails. So like, notice how with the theater of cruelty and that the eye may jump, and yet it fails, and it fails as a form of incest too. So the limit itself, in the sense of which it is impossible, is in its failure, right? What fails, right? It's the failure to go from the appellation to the person, from names to body. So this is like, a word kind of corresponding to a body. Well, this is why it's not.
It's the hard thing for us to understand when we say mom. You think of your mom, but the way that these tribes work, and again, anthropologically speaking, ethologically speaking, this is, as far as I'm aware, wholly universal. People didn't really have positions in that space. They didn't have a mom that meant always that this is mom, but instead the person being that role, playing the role of caregiver in any given moment. It could be aunts, uncle, it could be aunts, it could be grandmothers, it could be friends of the family, neighbors. Like, it's the role became contextual. I'm just re-adding what you're saying, that it's the movement from name to body was contextual, not hardline applied. Even if it was stamped on them like a tattoo, it still didn't mean the same thing and make the same meaning as we give it today. And that's the shift that they're talking about.
That stamping comes with, I don't want to make this like class psychoanalysis, right? But there's something almost compensatory about what's being done here through cruelty, right? In a sense, it kind of compensates for that jumping failure, but it's also more than that, because it's it's not simply to take it as just compensation. I think is a little reductive. But like, that being said, right, remember too that filiative piece is giving you objects into the chain, so to speak, and the alliance is giving you from the chain onto objects, right? So it's a way of talking about first into second synthesis. And by the alliance, second into first synthesis, right? So you have this distinction, like we're talking about, where the bodies and the signifying chains aren't necessarily getting a direct correspondence, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like your classic structuralism in linguistics.
Excellent. With that, I want to move on because as we move out of this, we're going to be talking now about the imperial system of inscription. And this is a different mode of how meaning is produced and how these elements work together. So, to continue. All this finds itself overwhelmed in a new destiny with the despotic machine and imperial representation. In the first place, graphism aligns itself on the voice, falls back on the voice, and becomes writing. At the same time, it induces the voice no longer as the voice of alliance, but as that of the new alliance, a fictitious voice from beyond that expresses itself in the flow of writing as direct filiation. These two fundamental despotic categories are also the movement of graphism that, at one and the same time, subordinates itself to the voice in order to subordinate the voice and supplant it. Then there occurs a crushing of the magic triangle. The voice no longer sings, but dictates, decrees. The graphy no longer dances. It ceases to animate bodies, but is set into writing on tablets, stones, and books. The eye sets itself to reading. Writing does not entail, but implies a kind of blindness, a loss of vision, and the ability to appraise. It is now the eye that suffers, although it also acquires other functions. Or rather, we are unable to say that the magic triangle is completely crushed. It subsists as a base and as a brick insofar as the territorial machine continues to function in the framework of the new machine. The triangle has become the base for the pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, the graphic, the visual to converge toward the immanent unity of the despot. If we call the order of representation in a social system a plane of consistency, it is evident that this plane has changed, that it has become a plane of subordination and no longer one of connotation. And here in the second place is the essential. The flattening of the graphy onto the voice has made a transcendent object jump outside the chain, a mute voice on which the whole chain now seems to depend, and in relation to which it becomes linearized. The subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice from on high, which inversely no longer expresses itself except through the writings, signs that it emits, a revelation. This is perhaps the first assembling of formal operations that will lead to Oedipus, the paralogism of extrapolation, a flattening out or a set of biunivocal relations that leads to the breakaway and the elevation of a detached object, the linearization of the chains that derives from this object. This is one of those massive, complex fucking paragraphs I love, but it's going to be a lot to go through. Hopefully we teed up enough information, though, that you're okay, at least generally, kind of grasping what they're going for. It's a move away from where we were under the earth socius, the primitive categories, the way that meaning was connotative, that debt was mobile, that things sort of were really contingent and connotative, now to this place where all of these elements are placed sort of, as they say, as a brick. It's crushed into a single thing in this larger chain, that there's now a single chain of meaning because we have a voice. We have a voice, the voice of, effectively, you could say, God, the one, whatever it may be, but we have a voice that tells us or is speaking to us through the written word. It's no longer connotative. It's no longer contextual. It's now, this is what is meant. Here are the words that I am saying. The words mean particular things always, always, universally. This shift, this plane of consistency that has changed is what they're driving us to. It's this understanding, this way they put it. They have the first place. In the first place, graphism aligns itself on the voice, falls back on the voice, and becomes writing. Writing and speaking, we basically consider very similar to be the way they operate. I'm speaking words, but you can very easily just write them down. This is different than the graphism of the earth, which was symbolic, connotative, allowed a very odd shifting. So I may say something. This is true of a lot of those old graphisms and very, very old quote unquote languages. I would say something, and I actually, as I talk, I can be changing. It sounds weird, but the words that are written would change. Not literally like morphing like magic, but more the way that they work does morph like magic, because the connotations of what I say versus what is seen there and who's seeing it, all of it can shift. This is gone. This is gone. The voice no longer is the voice of alliance, but this new alliance, this fictitious voice from beyond. So this is the first thing that happens. And then in the second place, the flattening of the graphy, the graphism, not writing, the graphism, onto the voice makes this odd transcendent element jump outside the chain, this mute voice, which is a fantastic way of putting it, because as you're reading, you don't actually hear a voice, but there is a voice that is speaking. There's a mute voice, which the whole chain seems to depend. As you're reading, the way that you make sense of the words you're reading is through this mute voice. Something is speaking, and you're presuming there's someone speaking. This mute voice exists outside of it, is creating this linearization that sort of creates the chain, item, 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 all the way through. And this really odd thing that happens as we start playing, it's the first assembling, as he says, of the formal operations that lead to Oedipus. But not just Oedipus as an example of the paralogism of extrapolation, their critique of representation in total. All this being said, it's a flattening out, a set of biunivocal relations that leads to the breakaway and elevation of this detached object, the linearization of the chains that derive from this object. This is the first introduction they have of really where we start to see Oedipus begin to form, this critique of representation begin to form, and these things come together. Really fantastic shit. I'm a big fan personally. But that's like my very short version of it. We can go through kind of bit by bit, but that's like more summary style. Jack, you got anything you want to add real quick to this?
I don't know about real quick, but I mean,
Well, I mean, just in general, but because I want to leave it open for other people to ask questions too, but go ahead.
yeah, I guess what I would say is like, what I would suggest is the focus here is again, like the two socii are in interaction with each other, right? There's a tension between them as opposed to a leaving behind of one for the other, right? And that's something they've been harping on since the beginning of the last section. So like what's going on here is they're talking about how, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the two uses of the syntheses are now um, both having changed and
Mm-hmm.
being put into relationship with each other. I guess that would be the general idea.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Put in direct relation with each other. Again, there was always a bit of a relation, like a connotation. I guess that's not the same as relation, but I guess it's one of the things I had trouble when I was first sort of going through this is when we talk about sort of graphism versus voice versus the eye. And then it's like, well, that's just writing. And it's like, no, they're talking about breaking it down like to those core pieces, the graphism being the etchings that aren't quite writing yet, not as we would call it writing. And here's where it makes that move, where by placing itself in line with the voice, imagine a writing that's not in line with the voice that it's speaking, a symbolic sort of etching, hieroglyphics of sorts, or there's a lot of sort of, you know, Norse symbolism. There's a lot of these things that sort of exist that aren't one-to-one. It's not like the letter A is the letter A or the word mom is for mom, but symbols that can kind of shift, but it's gone. This is a shift away from that to being MOM is mom, and the voice and writing being very in line with each other. Yeah, Bats, it's like a mathematical formalism has now attached itself to graphism, where suddenly it means a thing and it's particularized and now matching voice, because again, voice and writing now are effectively one to one. They're kind of the same thing, different forms of it, but they're together now.
I mean, it might be worth taking time to explore that a little bit. But Lily,
No, please.
I see you unmuted, so you might have a question.
Yeah. Is it a pyramid or a tetrahedron? Like, how many sides does it have?
Which part?
It says the triangle has become the base for a pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, the graphic, and the visual to converge toward imminent unity of the despot. Like a pyramid has 4 sides, tetrahedron has 3. So
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So again, the previous socius is still like what's happening there is still relevant, right? There's a tension between the two that Deleuze and Guattari are keeping as we move into the despotic socius, right? So it's not
okay,
eradicative or annihilative. It's
so that's
kind of combinative. So like
okay.
the theater of cruelty, the triangle you're talking about, right? In terms of it being a base or a brick, right? You know,
Okay.
the pyramid they're talking about is the state as they referenced it earlier, right? And so what
Okay.
they're kind of getting at is that, you know, the state as they've defined it is being
Mm-hmm.
built on top of the theater of cruelty, but not in a way that discards the theater of cruelty, right? So you have the state kind of built on that, right? So the new alliance and the extended affiliations are built on top of the, you know, alliances and
Mm-hmm.
affiliations of the primitive.
Yeah.
And now as you
So
kind of get it,
Another
it's kind of building upward.
another way to answer that, I think, because I think I know what you're getting at. They're not necessarily meaning that it's literally like they're putting a new shape in place. They are speaking slightly differently than I think than how you're taking it. So let's instead use slightly different language. In the Earth Socius, you have a trinary of elements. It's you can say it's a triangle because there's only 3 things. It has to be a triangle. It doesn't matter. But those 3 things aren't. It's not that a meaning has a triangle. Oh, this is the meaning, and I'm holding up this triangle. That's not really how it works. It's the 3 elements contingently at any given moment are constantly shifting. I'm talking to you about Steve in front of John, but I'm saying that John is a hunter. I'm saying Hunter John. And the context of what I'm saying and all that, it's right there because of the people who are around seeing what I'm saying, and the graphism etched and the tattoos that are around. Like, these things all combine to create the meaning of that moment. That meaning is, I would say, ephemeral. It vanishes pretty quickly right afterwards. That triangle isn't hardlined. This is different now. We've made the move where these things have been crushed, and that triangle is now a brick in a pyramid, because the voice is now the thing that is everything is dependent on. The meaning of the despot determines that triangle. So the pyramid is more saying that there is now this hierarchy of meaning amongst all of those different little bricks, or the triangles that are crushed into bricks, that are all over the place. So you have this really odd thing where now it's not that you have these contingent, constantly changing, like, triangle that's like morphing over time and changing because it doesn't, context matters so fucking much in all of this. Not the case anymore. Now that specific meaning, that setup that you've got, this is now a brick there because it was written that John is a hunter and a good hunter. That was said by the despot, God, whatever it may be, but the voice is dependent. So now the trinary that's in that brick, that is like permanent. Like, that's set. Like, it is a base for other meaning to come off of it.
okay. Like I was saying, the voice being one side, the graphic being the other side, and the visual being the third side, and that was what was converging. But so all 3 of those are contained in the bricks that make up the pyramid, and the despot, the
Yeah.
station of the despot is at the top.
It,
Okay.
the despot and the placement of that brick is never, the meaning of that brick doesn't get to change now, because the decree, and there's a reason they use these particular words. This is out of Spinoza. very, very heavily. But the idea of a decree and the idea of a demand on high, the rule, this is God, my forest, don't hunt deer in my forest. Men shall not sleep with men. That what is a man is not a thing that is discussed. Like, you don't do that at all. But in the old ways, you would be like, hey, Steve and John, like it's a lot more fluid and contingent. Not anymore. Now it's hunter means this in this particular way always, because the meaning comes from, and the I on high, the voice is the despot. The voice is no longer me speaking it contextually to you about a written, no, the written word makes it so it's the despot saying it. He's the one who's granting it value and meaning and all of the other shit. He's the one doing that thing. So this shift that's happening here is really hardcore. And it really changes, again, how we relate to this triangle of meaning that's now fully crushed inside of this very, very complex sort of interaction. And now it's not just that triangle. It's the reason they make this move to talk about the pyramid, and they will continue to, because the introduction of the state will get into the Urstadt. They want to keep all of this language going because it's, again, important to remember that the bricks that make up the pyramid, this is not something that like emergently happened. This was, the bricks had to be made this way, this size from on high. They were given orders. Here is the shape of the brick and the size that it's going to be going in this placement. They didn't just make whatever bricks, because that's not how it works. But we used to just make whatever bricks. It's not out of freedom. It's out of necessity and survival and fear and terror in a very different way. But now the bricks are specific. They're set, and they're set from on high, and they are held in place together against each other by that same downward force. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
So he's really describing a hierarchy of power based on language, based on the voice, and the graph. The graphism is subordinate to the voice, right?
Yeah, very much. Well, it's sorry, go ahead, Jack. You're good. I know you're going to say the same thing as me.
Well, I think I'm gonna suggest a risk though, right? Because we're kind of talking about this like, what the despot says goes, right? But it's a socius, right? So it's like, I just want to make sure we're thinking about this in terms of like the socius, the same way the BWO does the disjunctive syllogism, right? Because I don't think it's about like necessarily one-to-one correspondence per se. I think it's more about how the double bind is used to condense what would otherwise be an inclusive disjunction, right?
I agree, but
Because
I think
like
in this,
hold on, let me finish.
All right.
Because like the way the condensing is happening is through filiation and alliance, right? So like, when you're talking about law and accounting, right, it's going to work operatively through filiation and alliance. Okay, go ahead.
I'm agreeing. I'm just saying right now, I think they're trying to build the image because we are literally going to be talking about all of those in like 4 paragraphs. Like right now they're making the case and they're talking about it sort of from a human perspective. That's why they use the phrase, the triangle has become the base for a pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, graphic, and visual to converge toward the eminent unity of the despot who's at the top, like that thing. They're trying to get us to see this sort of shift that's happened, the hierarchy of meaning created in this, so we can make our move next into seeing how the double bind, how the other paralogisms sort of play into this. So I'm agreeing. I'm just I that's all. I'm just agreeing. I'm mostly, I guess.
Is that kind of description of language between writing and speech similar to what Derrida, talks about?
That's what I was going to answer. And it turns out I was wrong, Jack. We didn't answer the same way. There's a bit of a difference. There is, as they say, the writing becomes subordinate to the voice, but it's not just like a pure, simple subordination. So it's not that voice dominates writing. It actually becomes the opposite, and they've hinted at this by how they talk about it, where the voice sort of rules from beneath. writing rules from underneath, that by allowing itself to be subordinated, it actually comes out on top. And we'll be talking about sort of that as the representation and other elements move, and how voice ultimately becomes sort of enslaved by its subordinate. This would be one of the big sort of deviations from Derrida, and how he talks through these things. So that's just in this very specifically. There's this really interesting play that happens, but it's the next paragraph they talk about it. So right now the subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice from on high, which no longer expresses itself except through the writing signs it emits. This is this odd interplay that they're hinting at, that it's not just that the voice is in charge of writing, but that writing, by subordinating itself, actually becomes the one that is the thing expressed. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
This next little bit is, this next paragraph is fantastic. I'm going to grab a couple questions we've got up. Batts writes, also seems to open the possibility for meaning to build on top of past interactions, effectively breaking the link between contingent properties of each brick and their meaning. I mean, that is a big shift, for sure. That meaning, these things begin piling into each other, yes. But again, not in a good way. Not in a good way, because it's all under a very, very hardcore, brutal power structure of dictatorial strength inside of the despot, who everything depends upon as whole. So it's just being specific there. It's not in a good way, but yes, it's another piece. And we'll see more pieces of things, because this is also what's necessary for images to exist sort of freely. There's a lot of stuff that's starting to show up here. We're going to notice as we get to capital that is the good and bad, the different pieces of everything. But it's just not necessarily in a good way. But yeah, these things start to show up pretty quick. Any last notes or questions before we move to the next little bit here?
Just a quick note. As we're talking about language, be careful, because I know, I know very simply with Lacan, right? Language is a kind of castrating thing. If you notice, right, like language didn't just pop up in the despotic, right? It's through the signifying chains, which are part of desiring production, social production in general, right? So this relationship between the first and second synthesis is dealing with the relationship between those chains and the objects or the bodies, right? So as you're going through this, it's not so much, I don't think they're going to get to a point where they're going to say and then language happened and that's when things got castrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Points more that as the disjunction is changing, it's responding to itself. And by responding to itself, right, this is where the misuse comes in. It's creating a transcendent use of itself.
Any last notes before I dive forward into the next bit? I like this next part a great deal. There's a discussion of a sort of Muslim tradition. It's a ruqya or a shifa. They have other words for it. Really cool that we'll be going through, that I think makes their point excellently. But again, through this, be thinking through writing, voice, how these things have come together, how they work, versus how just graphism, the prior sort of systems and voice worked in connotation versus this very specific one-to-one. And he gives a great example, so I'll jump through it. It is perhaps at this juncture that the question, what does it mean, begins to be heard, and that problems of exegesis prevail over problems of use and efficacy. The emperor, the god, what did he mean? In place of segments of the chain that are always detachable, a detached partial object on which the whole chain depends, in place of a polyvocal graphism flush with the real, a biunivocalization, forming the transcendent dimension that gives rise to a linearity. In place of non-signifying signs that compose the network of a territorial chain, a despotic signifier from which all the signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flux of writing. Men have even been seen drinking this flux. Andres Simpleni shows how, in certain regions of Senegal, Islam superimposes a plane of subordination on the old plane of connotation of animist values. Quote, "The divine or prophetic word, written or recited, is the foundation of the universe. The transparence of the animist prayer yields to the opacity of the rigid Arab verse. Speech rigidities into formulas whose power is ensured by the truth of the revelation and not by a symbolic or incantatory efficacy. The Muslim holy man's learning refers to a hierarchy of names, verses, numbers, and corresponding beings, and if necessary, the verse will be placed in a bottle filled with pure water. The verse water will be drunk, one's body will be rubbed with it, and one's hands washed with it." End quote. Writing, the first deterritorialized flux, drinkable on this account. It flows from the despotic signifier. For what is the signifier in the first instance? What is it in relation to the non-signifying territorial signs when it jumps outside their chains and superimposes a plane of subordination on their plane of immanent connotation? The signifier is the sign that has become a sign of the sign, the despotic sign having replaced the territorial sign, having crossed the threshold of deterritorialization. The signifier is merely the deterritorialized sign itself, the sign made letter. Desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of the despot's desire. The mouth no longer speaks, it drinks the letter. The eye no longer sees, but reads. The body no longer allows itself to be engraved like the earth, but prostrates itself before the engravings of the despot, the region beyond the earth, a new full body. I adore this. So the Ruqya setup that they're talking here, the thing is literally writing and traditionally done like handwritten very beautifully in Arabic or local language, sure, but written on a small piece of paper, this verse or the word of God or the word that the man is supposed to practice or whatever it is, and then placed in a bottle, and they like let it sit there, and the ink tends to sort of float away. Like they don't use like waterproof ink or shit for this. Like it dissolves out, and then you drink the word. The word is to be drunk, and they wash you with it, and you wash with it, and you have your body rubbed with it, as if the word itself was the literal word of God now in that water, as if the word, the written word, was the spoken word of the despot, the God, the one on high. This is wholly different from that space of contextual, connotative interaction that we saw before. Then this is what they're explaining at the beginning, this polyvocal graphism flush with the real, the polyvocal graphism that tattoos the symbols, the graphics that existed in the earth, flush with the real, explosive with all the different possibilities and things it was attached to, has been replaced by this biunivocalization, forming a transcendent dimension that gives rise to linearity. No longer there with non-signifying signs that compose the networks of a territorial chain. This would be the way that the voice is spoken and used inside of sort of the hypercontextual, localized territorial chain. Now we have a despotic signifier from which all signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flux of writing. This is important. The words no longer are coming from whoever is speaking them necessarily, especially a written word. Now it's from on high, from God. This is not the case. God has never, as far as I'm aware, God has never written anything. He's written through other people miraculously. So these people have written, but it's not from those people. It's not from the prophet even, or the countless monks who translate, or the countless, whoever it may be, scholars rewriting and writing, or whatever you may say, or prophets or scumbags or whatever, all the people who've written no, it's never ever written by that person. It's God's writing. So it's up. It's above. It's the word, despite you watching a guy write it. Like, hey Steve, you gonna write that word for me? Sure, here it is. Cool. Oh, God wrote this. Excellent. I just watched you do it, Steve. That thing is then the word that is drank. This is the setup. This is the first deterritorialized flux. This drinkable on this account. It flows from the despotic signifier. Its source is the despotic signifier. This is that thing that has stepped outside, that's causing the linearization, that's causing the pyramid through which everything is getting its meaning. All the words now are this. That's why me watching Steve write it, somehow I'm able to, in my head, go, excellence, the word of God, because it is. Doesn't matter who the fuck wrote it. It's written by God. It's spoken by God, the mute voice on high. This changes things for us yet again. This is this moment where the word that's spoken is no longer the thing. It's not even contextually the thing. Now it's the thing of the thing. The signifier is a sign of the sign. It's this fascinating move. It's, as they say, the despotic sign replaced territorial, having crossed this threshold. The signifier is merely a deterritorialized sign itself. It's deterritorialized, removed from the earth, the territory, the space, its connotative existence, and now placed into this despotic relationship that is necessarily a signifier. It's a sign made letter. Very particular wording there. It's the sign not made graphic, made letter. Desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of desire. It's no longer desiring the thing, it's desiring the despot's desire. Because the despot is telling you what everything is, and you're in line with that. The mouth doesn't speak, it drinks the letter. The eye doesn't see, it reads. The body doesn't allow itself to be engraved by the earth, it prostrates itself before the engravings the despot has placed in front of it. The region beyond the earth, this new full body. Beautiful paragraph, I think, that really dives into it and I think explains it very well, but I know it's a lot. So with that, I'm going to shut the fuck up and we're going to open it up for questions and thoughts. If there are any. Not going to force it, but
If nobody has anything, I think it's worth going over what they mean by meaning here.
okay,
Um,
let's do it.
because I think this can be tricky, especially with all the like, I mean, they're talking signifiers, but it's not signifiers, right? Because it doesn't necessarily do that. So I mean, this stuff gets kind of unique for Deleuze and Guattari, but I mean, so in terms of like this question of what does it mean, right? So, you know, in a sense, right, what they're asking is, so we have the voice and the writing in a particular relationship, right? And there's a way in which for the earth that their relationship is sort of direct and down to earth, right? It's immanent. Um, whereas the despotic is now introduced to that immanent relationship, a new relationship on top of that, quite literally, right? And that's one of transcendence. In that sense, right? So, like this first chunk of the paragraph, what they're talking about is basically how lack um, precipitates the despot signifier. So, for you Lacanians, right, this is like S1, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a signifier that is basically outside of the group, right? And yet by which the group basically derives itself, right? So it's kind of imbued by the despot signifier, by the something that is seemingly unconditioned, right? So in that sense, when they're talking about meaning here, right, they're talking about meaning as it pertains to lack and as it pertains to the double bind, which we can start to say in this paragraph, right? basically what we're getting at is it's not like a reference the despot can constantly keep going to, right? It's that which is lacked and that which does the double bind, so the transcendent condensing, right, is going to be that by which meaning is spoken through. So the transcendent use of the voice and so forth, that is itself meaning here.
Yes, and it's with that. It's probably also worth talking a moment about how they talk about desire, because, and I'm putting together another video on this because a lot of people get this very wrong. I was watching, it spurred the video is I was watching the ContraPoints video on desire, and this is not them saying that people's wants, like they're actively going, I want what the despot wants. That's not at all what that's like a fucked up way of looking at desire. They're looking at desire as, again, libidinal desire, the passions. I think Spinoza would use the word more passions, but the things that are sort of at the base that are driving us, the material conditions of production of desire that ultimately creates the unconscious. So when they're talking here about the way that desire desires the desire of the despot, that desire no longer dares to desire itself. They're not talking about a subject being like, oh, wow, I guess I don't want stuff anymore. I only want what the despot wants. It's like, no. This is, to Jack's point, and the reason I know he's been harping on getting back to the way the paralogisms operate and the way the three syntheses work, the production of desire inside of this is what they're talking about prior to your conscious or even pre-conscious understanding of anything. What has produced that meaning, what has produced what desire is going after, how desire even operates. The shift here is is making a move, no longer in the connective, where things are sort of pre-allocated and set up in line with the earth, and desire is sort of just very much immediately taken and brutalized in various ways. Now it's that desire, the passions, the creation of all of these things, moves in a different place. It's that the desire that once directly connected with the earth now desires desire, but it's not just desire itself. It's the signification of a sign. It's desiring what the other wants. It's desiring what the despot says it ought to. This ruling of things, the way that these things become ingested in the unconscious, the way desire then turns on itself and begins to work, is what they're driving at. Again, this is not saying you want the desire, you want what the despot wants. It's oversimplified garbage version of it. It's very much talking through the paralogisms and the way the desire becomes malformed through this process. Is that a fair way of saying it, Mr. McGillicuddy?
Get us to that movie, man.
Is that a fair way of putting it?
Mostly the one thing I wanted to clarify though is like, I mean, the desire itself, right? Like when we're talking about lack and the double bind, right? Like it's the despot as this full body, and by which, right, there's still this question of flows moving across and everything. So like with this point about the despot signifier and so forth, it's not in the mind of the leader. It's in something removed from the chain, by the through the socius in a manner of speaking, but through production and desire itself, right? This is desire misusing itself, plain and simple in that sense. In misusing itself, right? It is basically taking something out of itself, lifting that up on high, so to speak, and using that to derive a meaning for itself, which is to say, the way that the filiations and alliances will function includes a relationship to that transcendent piece, right, which is going to do the double bind. This is all before you get into like the fourth paralogism too.
Oh yeah, we're not even at a place where that can even be really at this point anyway.
Is that kind of misuse you're talking about, kind of misuse of their will to power?
Will to power and desire and the passions are very much the same thing what we're talking about here.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, it's desire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Desire
So
is a
it's
tough one in English. It's one of the things that it's one of the reasons that they go about. I mean, even saying libido is challenging when they talk about and they go through the sort of way that libido transforms and becomes the energy of recording. The it's not that it's desire still, but it's a transformation. It's a not a sublimation. It's a switch to another to another to another, and so
Yes.
it's important to remember when we talk about desire, we're talking about sort of the royal version of all of that. But even desire, I think in English is a very challenging thing to say because we have a lot of personal ego in that. We think of desire like I want something, and again, really not the point. It's libidinal element. It's the libidinal element, the passion.
Yeah, right. So like for Freud, want is forced upon the ego by the id, right? Like the ego doesn't do the wanting, the ego deals with the wanting.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad you said that. You jogged my memory. That was the thing I wanted to say, right? So like for Lacan, you're going to go to the big other and the superego and so forth. And to some degree, Deleuze and Guattari have some engagement with the symbolic and the imaginary through the misuse of the second synthesis, right? At the same time, notice how it functions here, right? So they're not going to the symbolic and straight to the big other in the way that like Freud would go straight to the superego per se, right? They're going at it in a way in which the disjunction is using itself, using how the earth used it, and misusing itself all at the same time, right? Notice how the machinery for discussing lack and the double bind or the law of the father and so forth. Notice how that kind of differs here, right? And that takes the central primacy, whereas the symbolic and the imaginary kind of become like secondary to it, right? As opposed to something more primary that's typical in like a Lacanian discourse.
Yeah, it's a fair way to put it too. That says, could we say desiring not the concrete thing the despot desires, but rather the way desire works, shifts, and becomes intermingled with the desire of the despot? What I desire is first mediated by what I think. See, this is the challenge. Is it's not what you desire, not like you're already way after the point. It's the multitudes of ways that desire is connecting, operating, and generating meaning and potential connections and denying connections and creating repression before we even get to the point that you can say I. Like, so we're way before that. This is way early, and so when you talk about what the despot wants, that's not even really it either, because what the despot wants, it's not really it's not about the dude. Like it's King Henry VIII ain't the guy, even though he's the guy. He's not the despot in what they're talking about here. We're making a different move where we're talking about the nature of this power structure that exists creates this overall sort of linguistic field that naturally creates only biunivocal relations and connections. And these biunivocal connections, instead of allowing mobile connotative meaning to sort of exist as I wander and as I do different things inside of my tribe or with other tribes, now it's crushed into a very particularized location based on words that are interpreted. And interpreted not in terms of what does it mean right now, which I think would be a very interesting way to do it, but instead it's what does he mean? What does God mean by this? A great example would be how everyone interprets the Bible. You could just very much talk about that. The setup we're talking about when someone says in the Bible, oh, man shall not lay with another man. Well, he didn't mean it that way. What he meant is this. Oh, he didn't mean that we shouldn't eat shellfish or that we shouldn't have mixed fiber clothing. It's those things that sort of exist. What do they mean? Well, it's not what do the words mean contingently, contextually in what we're doing. That would be the graphism. Now, our question is, what is the meaning of the words to us? And the meaning is given to us, told to us, dictated to us by this system. And it's not, again, we've shifted. Meaning didn't exist. It's not, well, what does that gourd mean would not be a thing that someone would say, oh, you have a gourd tattoo. I wonder what that might mean. No, it's contingent and polyvocal and connects however it connects to me speaking about it, the people around us. All of those things determine this sort of cloud of meaning that happens and then vanishes. We're making a different move here. This is now, what does that mean? And it's not that mean in a vacuum. It's what did he mean by that? And what did God mean? What did the despot mean? What did the king mean? If there's an edict that comes along and says, kill every firstborn son. Well, wait, firstborn? Well, if they're twins, does it matter who's firstborn? Like, interpreting is not a question of contingently understanding based on conditions. It's instead, what does he mean to me? And so this setup is where desire starts getting fucked up, because now desire needs to get in line with another's desire, because the meaning of things is being told to me. It's not, I'm not taking things contingently. I'm not dealing with it as it comes. I now have to discern, divine, understand, grasp, or be in the terror of being wrong, what these letters in front of me mean to me. The eye doesn't see, it reads. The body doesn't allow itself to be engraved like the earth, emergently as necessary, whatever's happening. We're beyond that. Instead, now it prostrates itself before the engravings of the despot, a region beyond the earth, the new full body. And yes, this is why they mentioned exegesis appearing now. Yes, that's exactly why they mention that. The nature of all of these things starts coming together. Yes.
At the same time, and to add to that, right? Like in this point, they're talking about Newman itself here. So like this point about exegesis, right? Or however you want to pronounce it.
I always thought it was exegesis, but probably not.
Man, Latin's just not my forte. It's all Greek to me anyhow. But with that, right, like, so there's a way of getting at that, which is like the scholarly pursuit of trying to understand the text, right? Like more directly, what they're getting at is it's not like there's an answer up in the sky. It's that there's two things here, right? There's a lack and there's a despot signifier, right? And by that, Newman affects itself so that the alliances and affiliations, right, become kind of the central point here.
Mm-hmm.
So like when we're talking about exegesis, right, we're dealing with it in that sense of affiliation and alliance very directly, right? Because what you kind of have going on here is two uses of it, right? One in which we're dealing with the earth as it used Newman, right? As it created these disjunctions. And we're dealing with it as the despotic uses the disjunctions and uses Newman,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those two things together, right? That's how you deal. That's how you basically get this point about dealing with meaning, and by which, right? At best, exegesis here is more of. It's more of. See, when we think of people trying to, sit there and study what something means, it's more directly that the production of the text itself, or the production itself as Newman, right, is altering itself and affecting itself through affiliation and alliance directly, right? And it's doing that through, through the new affiliation, through the through the new alliance, and through the extended affiliation, and taking that upon alliance and affiliation in the earth, right? That whole tension basically becomes how you go about meaning.
It's a lot. It's worth it'll be worth coming back to this, because as again, they're layering in very quickly a lot of things here. And so it'll start coming together a little bit more as you get towards the end of the section. I always advise, after we've read it, go back and reread. Things come into piece a lot better, in my mind at least, in my experience. Also, we're going to start getting into a lot of semiotics here. Saussure, we're about to get into. When we move into capital, we get into Yelmslev. I highly recommend reading a little bit of Saussure's work because that will help a little bit as you make your way into a semiotic understanding. Hjelmslev, I almost don't recommend reading. I recommend reading books about Hjelmslev and on his work because his actual work is incredibly dense and difficult to pierce. But we're starting to get into that, how the semiotics of things operates. And this next little bit is continuing sort of this point about how the written word becomes the thing and how the sign and the signifier operate. And Bats, yes, Hjelmslev is so tough that Jack has never been able to pronounce his name.
You know Yumslav?
Hey, look, that might be the first fucking time ever. But it's because
that
I
actually
just said
how you
it. It's because I just said it. So that
Is it really Yumslav?
Hjelmslev, yeah.
Oh wow. It's the H, man. Like there's something about an H and a Y together that's just,
H and a
ungodly
J.
to me.
H and a J.
There's a J in there?
There's no Y in Hjelmslev.
What monstrosity is this?
Well, it's Danish, so it's a very silly language. So it is. I mean, it's not as silly as like, Norwegian or Swedish or Finnish, but it's pretty silly.
Or British English.
English isn't silly so much as just tiring. All right.
That's ultimate American common right there, just to make fun of British English.
It's fair. But we will continue though, because again, as we talk about this movement and how the word becomes the thing and how the sign is now the sign of a sign and no longer the thing, sort of contingently, connotatively, they're about to make that case, I think, extremely well. There's a lot of, we'll say, semiotic, technical, academic language in this next paragraph. I think it's fairly crisp, but as we go through, don't hesitate to make a note, like, what the fuck does this mean? And you can write in chat, or you just like a word, and I will explain it, and we'll go a little bit deep dive. We can talk about Saussure. We can talk about a little bit with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche touches into this. Nietzsche really, really has fun with this. So there's a lot of stuff we can do. But to continue. No water will ever cleanse the signifier of its imperial origin, the signifying master or the master signifier. That's just a dig right at Lacan. In vain will the signifier be immersed in the immanent system of language, or be used to clear away problems of meaning and signification, or be resolved into the coexistence of phonetic elements, where the signified is no more than the summary of the respective differential values of these elements and relationships among themselves. In vain will the comparison of language to exchange and money be pushed to its furthest point, subjecting language to the paradigms of an active capitalism, for one will never prevent the signifier from reintroducing its transcendence and from bearing witness for a vanished despot who still functions in modern imperialism. Even when it speaks Swiss or American, linguistics manipulates the shadow of Oriental despotism. Ferdinand de Saussure does not merely emphasize the following: that the arbitrariness of language establishes its sovereignty as a servitude or a generalized slavery visited upon the masses. It has also been shown that two dimensions exist side by side in Saussure, the one horizontal, where the signified is reduced to the value of coexisting minimal terms into which the signifier decomposes, but on the other, vertical, where the signifier is elevated to the concept corresponding to the acoustic image, that is, the voice, taken in its maximum extension, which recomposes the signifier. Value as the opposite of the coexisting terms, but also the concept as the opposite of the acoustic image. In short, the signifier appears twice, once in the chain of elements in relation to which the signified is always a signifier for another signifier, and a second time in the detached object on which the whole of the chain depends, and that spreads over the chain the effects of signification. There is no phonological or even phonetic code operating on the signifier in the first sense, without an overcoding affected by the signifier itself in the second sense. There is no linguistic field without biunivocal relations, whether between ideographic and phonetic values or between articulations of different levels, monemes and phonemes. that finally ensure the independence and linearity of the deterritorialized signs. But such a field remains defined by a transcendence, even when one considers this transcendence as an absence or an empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, and subordinations, a transcendence whence issues throughout the system the inarticulate material flux in which this transcendence operates, opposes, selects, and combines the signifier. It is curious, therefore, that one can show so well the servitude of the masses with respect to the minimal elements of the sign within the immanence of language, without showing how the domination is exercised through and in the transcendence of the signifier. There, however, as elsewhere, an irreducible exteriority of conquest asserts itself. For if language itself does not presuppose conquest, the leveling operations that constitute written language indeed presuppose two inscriptions that do not speak the same language, two languages, one of masters, the other slaves. Jean Nogueirol describes just such a situation. Quote, "For the Sumerians, a given sign is water. The Sumerians read this sign, A, which signifies water in Sumerian. An Akkadian comes along and asks his Sumerian master, 'What is the sign?' The Sumerian replies, 'That's A.' The Akkadian takes the sign for A, and on this point there is no longer any relationship between the sign and water, which in Akkadian is called mu. I believe the presence of the Akkadians determined the phoneticization of the writing system, and that the contact of two peoples is almost necessary before the spark of a new writing can spring forth." So much happening here. There's like a lot happening in this paragraph. I'm not actually sure where to even start.
We can always kind of go piece by piece here.
Yeah, we can. It'll just take a little bit. So if you want to start, go for it.
Sure. So, I mean, so like what I've been talking about, like signified, signifier, writing, voice, filiation, alliance, right? Like they just keep stacking on top of that. It's like alliance, of course, is related to voice, is related to signifieds now. And, basically what we're going to go through in this paragraph is another layer on that, right? And that layer is going to help us explain how overcoding functions,
Yes.
right? And they're going to give Saussure some credit for that. So like this first bit about, there's no
Real quick, I
linguistic
just want to make
field.
sure, just because it's worth emphasizing, you use the word overcoding spot on here, and it is what they're getting at, how overcoding happens and occurs, and they give Saussure credit for that. It's just, I want to make sure we just focus on it because it's really an important part of this section. Please continue.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this point about no linguistic field without biunivocal relations, right? So like this is them saying that there is no linguistics without the second paralogism, right? Without the law of the father, so to speak, right? So this point we've been talking about how there's a despot signifier by which meaning is derived, right? And by which we mean, this transcendent use of condensing upon the fidelity of the alliant. That is what gives you linguistics, as Deleuze and Guattari want to engage it. So this first part is basically getting at that and talking about how deterritorialization helps do that, right? To create that lifted up sign. But such a field remains defined by a transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
So even though there's deterritorialization, it's a deterritorialization defined by the despotic signifier, right? By a transcendent use. I'll finish the sentence and can open the floor. Even one considers this transcendence as an absence, channeling some Derrida there, transcendence as an absence or an empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, or abattements, and subordinations, a transcendence which whence issues throughout the system, the inarticulate material flux in which this transcendence operates, opposes, selects, and combines the signifier, right? So we're taking desiring production and we're contextualizing it in this kind of linguistic sense, because the transcendent field they're talking about here, right, still deals with that kind of material use of desire, but it's going to do it through transcendence, right? I'll give, as promised, open the floor there.
No, I think most of this paragraph, like as we're going over it, most of this paragraph is very clearly a response. Like it's an, I don't want to say it's an unasked for response, but they're responding and critiquing a lot of other work in the space. Derrida and Lacan and those around them, I think, most namely. But there's a lot of work done inside of that space, especially in the 50s and 60s, leading into this book in critical theory that I think they're going at, and others that they're focusing and trying to elevate. Their underlying critique, I think, is fairly clear if you take the paragraph as a whole. A lot of work has been done and a lot of attempts have been made to try to take semiotics for what it is on its own. Like, what does a thing mean as if it was existed in a vacuum? But you're unable to do that. And their argument is basically you're always coming back to the same sort of thing. Like, what does the despot mean? Like, who's determining the meaning of language? There's a lot of ways to go about it, but ultimately you still have this consistently imperial origin that's poking its head up. And so as everyone else, and a lot of, I don't want to say Derrida only, there's a lot of people trying to make semiotics sort of stand on its own, or linguistics sort of stand on its own. Chomsky, I think, gives up on that almost entirely. The idea that meaning can exist as we use it, as these things operate, without there being an other, without there being a master, without there being a king, without there being a despot, without there being the shadow of, as they say, this oriental despotism, which I fucking hate, the language of, but it doesn't matter what language, it always comes back to this thing. It always comes back to this servitude, a general slavery visited upon the masses. Saussure, they explain, and he goes very deeply into this. They have, the footnote says, Bernard Petrarch tries to establish a rapprochement between Nietzsche and Saussure, starting from the problems of domination and servitude. And he does this, I think, really well. They quote, he does well to remark that Nietzsche, in contrast to Hegel, causes the master-slave relationship to go by way of language, not by way of labor, which is a huge change. So when he comes to the comparison with Saussure, he retains language as a system to which the masses are enslaved and consigns to fiction the Nietzschean idea of a language of masters through which this enslavement is accomplished. This shift is happening, and it's the thing to be watching for, is that it's built in to the nature of language, of linguistic systems as they exist. And the example that they give in the base version of this, a language can't possibly sort of exist without having one group dominating another, not in the written way that we're talking about, not where something has to be explained, because again, the contingency of a symbol doesn't really have to be explained to those who are within the tribe and already are aware of it. So the Sumerians who enslaved the Akkadians are absolutely like bereft of freedom, to say the least. The Akkadian comes along and asks the Sumerian master, what is that? And he's pointing to the sign. There's a sign next to a lake. It's like, here's water. Sumerian goes, well, that's water. But he's pointing at the sign. But now that sign means water, but it's not water. That sign's a fucking sign, and it's the word water. Like, this shift in this explanation, this moment that happened, this is the first point. This is what Jean Nogoriel is talking about. This point is where we actually found this system being constructed for the first time. The presence of the Akkadians determined the phoneticization of the writing system. The way that these things happened, how you would speak these things, how you would explain what this sign is, this created the phoneticism of the writing language, and that the contact of two peoples is necessary before the spark of new writing can spring forth. Writing working with voice like this, ultimately subjugating one or the other, it necessitates this master-slave, high-low power dynamic in order to even be made in the first place. And this paragraph is really driving home this idea that you can't have that without the power dynamic in it. The power dynamic's built into language as we use it and as we understand it. That's probably the best way I have to summarize this one. There's a lot of really good lines in here. I think that's fantastic and we could go into, but that's like the big thing that they're driving at is like, nothing exists in a vacuum. Stop pretending that these things exist outside of it. That's not the point. Stop that. Realize that as they exist, this linguistics necessitates this master-slave relationship. It necessitates who means what. We see this, it came out, I think, right around the time we were doing this section last time, is that awful fucking documentary from the shithead on the Daily Wire. It's like, what is a woman? And it's like, the entire thing is about sort of this consistent appeal to an authority. It's not a spoken authority, but it's an authority, and as to what this word means, how this word means, how this operates, necessitates that master-slave relationship. Things can't exist in a vacuum. That's how I'm going to phrase it. There you go. Nothing? No one? No applause? I expected applause. No, I didn't. I'm fucking with you. Like, someone say something. Make sure I'm still connected to the goddamn internet. Okay. Excellent. This is one of those horrifying dreams.
Well, I mean,
there we go.
I guess there's. I mean, do we keep reading the paragraph here?
No. I'm just more just generally. Am I in line with how you're reading it too, Jack? Any because there's a lot being said. I get that. It's like super deep shit, and it's super important. So I'm probably asking a lot from everyone, but I just want to make sure I'm generally pushing people in the right direction as we make our way through this next sort of bit, because the next paragraph really is another critique in line with this. This one I think is squarely at Derrida, really hard, because Lacan had no intention of getting away from the master signifier, and his work never ever pushed as a such thing. But other people in linguistics saw liberatory possibilities, and they're like, no, that's not how language works. So the next one is they're going to be pushing into Lacan very hard, and it's a big critique. The next one.
For the primitive, right, though, there's no like signifier, right? So I mean, to some degree, there's. So this is, I guess, the question I would ask you is like, I'm not as sure about the master slave bit, because I read that like, I mean, one of the things about the disjunction, right, is it creates ethnicity, right? There's ethnicity in its production and its productivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I read that, like, so are you saying subjugation is necessarily part of like? I'm trying to follow how you're reading that.
I would. So let's see. How do I want to attack responding to that? Because it's. They say explicitly, it is curious that one can show so well the servitude of the masses with respect to the minimal elements of the sign within the immanence of language, without showing how the domination is exercised through and in the transcendence of the signifier. They open by saying, no water will ever cleanse the signifier of its imperial origin, signifying master or the master signifier. This is the necessity of the signifier, of signification as works within linguistics. And they're sort of being shitty and saying like, it's just weird. You can so well show the servitude of masses with respect to minimal elements of the sign within the immanence of language without showing how domination is exercised through and in the transcendence of the signifier. But that's sort of they're being a little jokey there. The next sentence I say is, for if language itself does not presuppose conquest, the leveling operations that constitute written language indeed presuppose two inscriptions that do not speak the same language, two languages, one of masters, the other of slaves. Like they're outright saying that the necessity of the written language, of the beginning of the signifier-signified relationship, of the desire of the other, it comes from and presupposes like two groups, one of masters, one of slaves. Now, they don't necessarily mean that like they have like unique languages, like there's a secret handshake in the Illuminati and that like the Jews in the cave have like a special way. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about that the power dynamics of a society hitting another society, that the introduction of the written word or graphism interacting, suddenly the graphism becomes the word, and suddenly we see the phonetic come along. This is why they use the example of Sumerians with the Akkadians. The Sumerians didn't like out of nowhere go, hey, we should write things down and we should have words. That's not how shit works. Instead, it's emergent interactions materially produced by the environment and the situation. And the reality is the Akkadians don't have the same graphic relations that the triangle of theirs did. So this interaction of two tribes, one deeply having power over the other. The Akkadians straight up were slaves. The Sumerians, therefore, aren't walking around going, hey, Akkadian, what does that mean? They don't give a fuck. Fuck the Akkadians. They just get on our level, basically. The Akkadians care a great deal. And so when they go, what is that? And they see these scratchings, and the Sumerian goes, oh, that's water. Now the slave has to know this. The slave knows this specifically because the Sumerian told him this. And this means that because he told me it means that. And so now we have, for the first time, a semiotic element. We have a signifier of signified, not at all related to water. It's about water, sure, but now we have the written word and the understanding of water before we even get to water. It's no longer that, hey, see that symbol, get refreshed, or whatever the fuck the triangulation would be under the earth. It's now this abstracted, odd interaction of desire going, okay, oh, yeah, that's what they tell me water means. So that's what, like, it shifts how desire thinks of these things. So necessarily power is built into the way that semiotics and linguistics works. Yes.
Okay, but are you trying to keep the power in the master-slave dialectic?
I'm not really using the master-slave dialectic here, no. Just the
Well,
nature of master-slave
okay.
as
At the
the
same
as the
time, like,
relationship, the power dynamic itself.
well, okay, but at the same time, like that, you talked about the footnote,
Yes.
right? So, I mean, I think one of the telling parts of that is when they write, but when he proceeds to the comparison, the Saussure retains language as a system to which the masses are enslaved, and consigns to the fiction the Nietzschean idea of a language of masters through which this enslavement is accomplished.
Correct. Because
Right?
the Nietzschean concept
Okay.
of the master language is, I don't want to say superior language, but it really plays into some sort of odd takes there. And they're saying it's not that there's like a master language that like wins or has power, but that the interaction of the two places one in the position of being the master language. And it's not like some secret language through which enslavement happens. It's that there is a master who has a language through which, and because of that, language then enslaves. So it's more emergent than determinist, I guess would be a way I'd probably phrase it.
Okay, because like if I follow them correctly, right, what they're saying is so it's not that there's a master race and a slave race, right?
Mm-mm.
And by that we can extend a master language on like a slave language, right? Like how he talks about like the Aryans and their use of the
Correct.
word
No. Nietzsche is very much
good
more
and
determined that the people who were in charge, it was because, like, it again, it depends on how you read Nietzsche, and I have different takes on a lot of Nietzsche, I think. Anyway, some people have taken from Nietzsche that he would say, oh, the Aryan language is superior. It's the language of masters. Like, it's almost the thing we need to try to be. It's like, no, that's silly. These people were in power through a whole bunch of different reasons.
part of this thing is like the language itself reflects. It's almost the language of reflection. The language itself is what they value,
Right.
right? So the good is what they value. But like the only reason I bring it up here is I think the question it poses, right, is, you know, what can you really say about enslavement and what is a master slave here, right? Because as I read it, like what this last bit of the paragraph is doing, right, is it's recapitulating the point about overcoding, so that the creation of the overcoding, right, so that the creation of the transcendence is more or less the kind of master thing that's being discussed, right? And in that sense, it's not specific to an ethnicity, I think, or at least
I agree
I
with
think
that.
that's the implication.
No, I agree with that.
Because like I think the general thing is that like the Akkadians, no, it's the oh boy, the Sumerians, right? So the
Yes.
Sumerians have a use of overcoding, I think, if I'm following this correctly, right? Or rather, they have a use of linguistics where it's more in line with the despotic as been described. The the Akkadians approach that and like the Earth have that kind of separation, I think, because they have a well, that's the tricky part of it. But in that sense, in the interaction, right, because of the use of voice, there's a way I think the implication they're getting at is by way of the voice of the Akkadians, right? There's a way in which the transcendent voice uses that to speak to both of them in a manner of speaking, right? Because I this is the tricky thing about biunivocalization. I think the difference between the two, right, is what gets reduced in the double bind. And I'm trying to put this together for myself too, because it's a lot of
No.
a
So
lot of
but
words. I think
what you're
this
saying
gets
is what I'm
hidden, right?
saying very much, I think. So, the Sumerians defeated the Akkadians and took them over and enslaved them. This is not like this is not due to some inherent greatness on the Sumerians' part in any capacity, or their language being that of masters or some silly stupid shit. There's a lot of material conditions that went into producing wins and losses in various ways. It's the way it goes. Any tribe that deals with any other tribe and defeats them, or this happens with in any capacity, you'd run into the same thing. You have a graphism local to your tribe. Like the locality of it is polyvocal and built polyvocally, because these symbols like are graphisms. They're not words. They're not literally words. They're slashes or lettering. Sumerian, you know, didn't have like a very complex alphabet, but they had an alphabet. But it wasn't like one to one. It was more symbolic. And so it's like the way that the reaction and interaction of these groups works, the Akkadians don't have a capacity for the same understanding of the graphism that you would have if you lived in a tribe and had been, you know, scarified, tattooed, and dealt your entire life with the various symbols that were around you. The way that they can be sort of mushy and fit whatever we're talking about and how we talk about it, right? So when you have one tribe that's necessarily having a power dynamic over another, and they have the graphism for water, an Akkadian will go, "What's that?" That person is not going to go, "Oh, that's our graphism for the sensation of drinking and being like," or whatever the fuck it means polyvocally. Is going to go, "Oh yeah, that's lake water right there, boom." And now the Akkadian, like, because they're fucking gonna be killed by the Sumerians if they don't learn this shit. Now they track it. They're like, okay, that means water, and it means water, not that water. It doesn't mean the drinking of water. It means water. It's the signifier of the signified. It's a sign of a sign. This is where the separation happens, and as such, by sort of joining up, the Akkadians, by joining this process for the Sumerians, now they're able to go, oh yes, water, and they can point to the sign, or they can begin to say the word because they know the word. But now everyone is starting to use this written word, these letters that these eyes are now reading and not seeing, these symbols that are no longer polyvocal but now biunivocal, because you need to know what the slaves are saying. This power dynamic exists and creates the situation in which linguistics necessarily switches from the graphism and takes on the master signifier of here is what is meant. And by is meant, we mean at large by the despotic ultimately. And this is what overcodes the territorial chain. So it's biunivocalized on every side, because it's not that the people in power don't use the same fucking signs. Of course they fucking do. They totally do. But now they have to deal with their slaves saying these words and writing it. And now they're writing the word and they're using it this over very short period of time. And this is what really the example that's given there. Jean Negreau, we went through it last time, but he sort of describes a sort of genealogy of language from this moment on, the genealogy of written language, to where at some point people could just write, I need water. And I meaning the person writing it, need meaning necessary, whatever. Like, things are defined, things are owned, things have the master signification behind it for both parties, not just the subordinate, but everybody. And that was what the footnote, as I read the footnote, and as I've read parts of that book, I haven't read the whole thing, I need to find it, is going through is it's dismissing the idea of like, oh, the masters have their own language and it was special, and that's what Nietzsche was doing in his play with the Aryans. Like, no, they also got taken in by this. Like, this isn't something where they're like, oh, here's the language we use with the slaves. It's like all of us use this language, all people, and it ends up becoming that controlling function, because desire, the libidinal energy, no longer has the polyvocal ability to sort of match contingently what is necessarily needed or written into the earth in a given moment in the first syntheses. Now it has to connect, but it has to connect biunivocally. It has to figure out what the other is desiring before it can desire. And this shift is very different, and everyone's got to do it. Everyone's got to do it, because that's how language works. Does that make sense, Jack? I kind of went on for a long time, but like this, I think we're saying the same thing. And I think if you bring it around, this is how you get into that double bind where I have to agree with the words that you're using. Master or slave doesn't even matter at this point, because communication's communication. You're writing shit down and I'm going, you need water, because I'm reading the words. Now that's it. Who determined that for me? Is that contingent? No. That becomes another block in the pyramid from the top down with pressure that everyone's going to remember. I need water. I have pain. All these words start taking on these meaning that are biunivocalized, no matter who's saying them.
Yeah, that last bit I think is the critical thing, because like if I'm reading this correctly, right? So like if you just stuck with Nietzsche, it would be like saying, right, like the master language is that which simply says what it has to say, whereas the slave language is that which speaks through resentment, right? Um, but I think what's hitting here, at least for me, is right, like beyond that, is a form of language, right? It's not it's not looking at which race is the master and slave. It's looking at overcoding as doing the enslavement, right? Because that enslavement is the biunivocalization, right? I think you and I are saying this together, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the sense in which the two different uses of Newman, the two different groups here, right? The differences in those uses and so forth, right,
Mm-hmm.
are being subordinated to the overcoding, right?
Yes.
And in that sense, it
Oh, yes.
happens to favor the is it the I have trouble with
It
this
doesn't favor.
it
So
favors the Sumerians in a
I'm
sense, but
hesitant. Yeah,
in
it
reality
favors
it's
on the
the
surface,
overcoding.
but it only favors it sort of in retrospect, because so like Sumerian language and written word, they're like famous for it. That's like the reason it favors it. But the reality is, like, this interaction created their enslavement to the word just as much.
So that's part of why I'm focusing on this, right? Because if we go straight to like the enslavement is a question of one race over the other, like how do you explain Latin overtaking Greek, right? It starts to get a little tricky because the Greeks happen to know how to write, and they had arguably an empire, supposedly.
I mean, the
But
Romans did pretty
you
good.
know, so did the Greeks, man. But you know, obviously, I guess in our day and age, right, as men, we only think about Rome, right? But putting
That's
the
the joke.
jokes aside,
But no,
yeah,
you're spot on, because when we start talking about that, language does this, and that it's part of this sort of underlying power structure. The nature of seeing the signified and the signifier. No longer are we dealing with a polyvocal element that's productive in its meaning and that's changing. We now see the sign that says water, and we think of water. So now we've got the signifier and the signified, this signifier being the sign, the word water. Like, just write the word lake and next to a lake, and like have someone walk by and they're like, what's that? And you go, that's lake. Now they know the word lake. We get that. That's doing the thing, because the lake is behind it. You're not pointing, oh, that's a lake. No, you're pointing at the sign. This very particular arrangement of things. It doesn't really matter at that point how Latin or Greek or other languages come and go, because they're part of the entire power structure. It's the nature of how they interact that creates. It's not about the dominance of any one language over another. It's the dominance of the written word is the big deal, I guess, would be the way I'd phrase it. Does that make sense?
it's the overcoding itself, right?
Yes,
By
because of the
which
written word.
the subordination. Well, the overcoding is doing the subordinating, right? It's one way of talking about what you're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the written word is subordinates itself to the voice, I believe it is. Well, I'm getting on my last leg on this 2 hour part, but yeah, I think we're trying to say it in slightly different ways there.
Yeah. Let's see. Rimka, the second to last sentence. If you could copy and paste it, that would be great, and I'll bump through it. For Lily, non-signifying signs is a different discussion. We will get there. Don't worry. That we're coming. But right now, we're talking about sort of the nature of linguistics. And the reality of, because we have the question in the YouTube chat too, like, do words mean anything? And that the answer is, of course they do, because like that's the nature of them. They mean things, but how we derive their meaning, how meaning is constructed from them, is a big deal. This is ultimately what linguistics is about, or semiotics, is trying to figure out how we find meaning in words, because we find it, or in Deleuze's, we build sense, we make sense of the words, and how we go about doing this, whether it's Lacan, Derrida, Deleuze, Yamslev, Saussure, whatever it may be. This process is really important of how we make meaning from words, because it's not like we magically divine and happen to get it right. We're reading, we're seeing things, the words we put in order, we're determining the meaning of based on, again, the authority of the voice, this mute voice that's telling us what they are. And so how we find meaning, how meaning finds us, how meaning is made, is a hugely important deal, because how repression happens, how we come to prefer one option over another, or how we determine that man exclusively means masculine and not feminine, how we biunivocalize all of these elements into specific things. This process is not something that is based to spoken words. It's based to linguistics. It's based to different things, but it's not based to human experience. It's not based to desire. Desire doesn't have to operate like that, as they have shown and as they will continue to show as we find different places for the despotic signifier and the master signifier to exist. So this move is really important to really grasp and sort of make play with. And that's this next paragraph, which I do want to read, because it is about what we're talking about. Rimka says, in short, the signifier appears twice, once in a chain of elements in relation. Is that the last sentence I read? You behind or in front of? I can never tell.
I think you read 2 paragraphs at once, and then I just focused on the second one.
Oh, I mean, it's...
She's talking about the previous paragraph, I think.
Oh, it's a long paragraph, the previous one, so maybe I went over it. It's okay. Rimcast, can you explain? Quote, in short, the signifier appears twice, once in a chain of elements in relation to which the signified is always a signifier for another signifier, and a second time the detached object on which the whole of the chain depends that spreads over the chain and affects the signification. The first time that the word appears, it exists in a chain of elements into relation. The signified is always a signifier for another signifier. In a sentence, the word that you're looking at, that is this thing, is always signifying something else. It's a signifier for another signifier. It's not a signifier for the object anymore. It's not signifier for water. It's a signifier for the word water, or the signifier water as a thing. Then the second time it shows up is as that second thing. That second thing is, what is water? Water is determined by the despot or the authority, the thing on high. So to go with Matt Walsh, what is a woman? Well, woman first appears in the sort of chain of signification, and it's a signifier for the word woman. What is woman? Well, from on high, does this word designate this thing? Is it able to designate this thing? Who tells me that? Well, it's on high, what the word is, the dictionary, the authority. This is what tells me what the word means. This is how the signifier appears twice. This is what they mean when they say that, at least.
I read it a little differently.
Go for it.
I think it's... So, I mean, the signifier is getting at, like, the physical piece of it, and then, like, the signifier is getting at the mental piece of it, right? Like, that's your basic 2 halves of the sign.
Mm-hmm.
Without going into, like, the use of disjunctions and all of that, right?
Real quick,
So
I'm hesitant to say it's 2 pieces of the sign yet, because I think what they're talking about there...
It's
I know it
Saussure.
is, but I know that is yes, that is Saussure. That's the horizontal and vertical that he's describing as they describe in the paragraph, right? But well, no, it's probably fine. I'm trying to oversimplify. I probably shouldn't do that. Please continue.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, I mean, so so you have a signifying chain, right? So it's like just like Lacan in that sense, in relation to which the signified is always a signifier for another signifier. So in a chain, right, there's a relationship of the signifiers in that chain to a signified, right? Some sort of kind of mental thing, right? Um, and that thing is actually a signifier for all the other signifiers. So even though it's a kind of mental thing, it still functions as a kind of physical thing, keeping this in just strictly Saussurian terms, right? At the same time, that thing reappears in a transcendent use. So in one sense, you have it as a signified. In another sense, you have it as, um, a signified that still operates as a signifier. And then the second sense, you have it as the despotic signifier. So you have it as still kind of being part of the signifiers, even though it's a
It's the detached
signified,
object.
and you have it lifted up.
The
Yeah,
detached object at that point.
yeah. I'm kind of bypassing all the use of the disjunction and all that,
And I think the next
just
paragraph...
trying to hit Syrian like.
Well, then the next, I think I'm going to read the next paragraph because I think it gets into that. We will stop there because afterwards it'll go really hard specifically into overcoding and signification, which I want to save for next week because it's a large... The next few paragraphs are really nice together because we return to incest. Boy, some of these things I fucking say, I just can't believe some sentences that come out of my fucking mouth sometimes. Next week we return to incest excitedly. And like, what the fuck? But it's a larger story of how the representation of incest has been layered in and rebuilt, and signification works within that. I will say worse things. The next like 5 fucking chapters, 5 sections have like genuinely sentences where I'm going to say awful shit, and it's intentional. it gets a thing. This book is something else. But to read. One cannot better show how an operation of biunivocalization organizes itself around a despotic signifier so that a phonetic and alphabetical chain flows from it. Alphabetical writing is not for illiterates, but by illiterates. It goes by way of illiterates, those unconscious workers. The signifier implies a language that overcodes another language. Well, the other language is completely coded into phonetic elements. And if the unconscious, in fact, includes the topical order of a double inscription, it is not structured like one language, but like two. The signifier does not appear to keep its promise, which is to give us access to a modern and functional understanding of language. The imperialism of the signifier does not take us beyond the question, what does it mean? It is content to bar the question in advance, to render all the answers insufficient by relegating them to the status of a simple signified. It challenges exegesis in the name of recitation, pure textuality, and superior scientificity, which is a really great translation actually from the original. Like the young palace dogs, too quick to drink the verse water and who never tire of crying. The signifier, you have not reached the signifier, you are still at the level of the signifieds. The signifier is the only thing that gladdens their hearts, but this master signifier remains what it was in ages past, a transcendent stock that distributes lack to all the elements of the chain, something in common for a common absence, the authority that channels all the breaks flows into one and the same locus of one and the same cleavage, the detached object, the phallus and castration, the bar that delivers over all the depressive subjects to the great paranoiac king. O signifier, terrible archaism of the despot, where they still look for the empty tomb, the dead father, and the mystery of the name. And perhaps that is what incites the anger of certain linguists against Lacan, no less than the enthusiasm of his followers. The vigor and serenity with which Lacan accompanies the signifier back to its source, to its veritable origin, the despotic age, and erects an infernal machine that welds desire to the law, because, everything considered, so Lacan thinks, this is indeed the form in which the signifier is in agreement with the unconscious, and the form in which it produces effects of the signified in the unconscious. The signifier as the repressing representation, the new displaced represented that it induces, the famous metaphors and metonymy, all of that constitutes the overcoding and deterritorialized despotic machine. We'll go back through. I want to read the base line here because I really like this ending. See Elizabeth Rudnesco's excellent article on Lacan, where she analyzes the twofold aspect of the analytic signifying chain, the transcendent signifier on which the chain depends. She shows that, in this sense, Lacan's theory should be interpreted less as a linguistic conception of the unconscious than as a critique of linguistics in the name of the unconscious. Such a fucking good line. Now, this is one of those things that, like, there's a lot of ways to interpret what they're saying with Lacan, because there's a lot of ways to interpret Lacan. There's a lot of ways to interpret Lacan. There's a lot of ways Lacan interpreted Lacan. So when we'll get to that in 2 seconds. But the underlying thing they're really trying to sort of drive at, I think, has a really great phrasing in here. Everyone's trying to get at, what does it mean? And answer that question. And they want that question really not there. They don't want to, like, what does it mean? No. It's not about what does it mean. That's silly. That's grand. No. We need to drink the verse water. We need to imbue ourselves with it. We need to bring it in. We forget the master signifier that's there. We forget the way that this sort of nature of linguistics operates. And specifically, they say Lacan does this thing, and again, they do the complement slap, very, very Guattari and Deleuze. I'm not going to explain all of Lacan, but the short version, Lacan goes, look, you need to be aware there is a master signifier. There is a big other. There is this grand story that you're sort of taking part in, and that these symbols are dancing according to this line, and this law of things, this setup that creates the master signifier and the signification chain of all of it that extends from this. This is where the unconscious is happy, when this is in line. When this is broken, when someone doesn't have a proper father and they become a psychotic and they have no master signifier. Good Lord, how terrible. Or the neurotic who over-identifies and has too many. The balanced man, the good, healthy man has a master signifier, because this is what the unconscious wants. And this is where it's the happiest. And this is why, as they say, a lot of people shit on Lacan for saying this. And they're like, no, he identified it. He just didn't go far enough. Ultimately, as they like to continue to say, that ultimately this is not where the signifier is in agreement with the unconscious, but it is an absolute understanding of how the master signifier operates. It is always at the top. The signifier, ultimately, as the repressing representation, this signified, then the signifier, the new displaced represented, it induces, the signified, the metaphors, metonymy, all of that ultimately is just overcoding and overcoding within the deterritorialized despotic machine. Fantastic sort of little thing they've got there. Go for it, JK.
Yeah, would you say that Lacan is normalizing this kind of master signifier, and that's what Deleuze's disagreement with Freud and Lacan is?
I wouldn't say necessarily Freud, because I think this is where Lacan really breaks with Freud, but I wouldn't say, saying Lacan is normalizing it is actually technically correct, but I would even go even further. Like for Lacan, he's not even normalizing it. He's just saying this is the transcendent, absolute, total reality of the best of us. Like this is what you need to understand. This is how everyone is. Like just accept the fucking law, and you can be free by accepting submission to the master signifier. More or less. And so it's normalization it's correct, but he's like really going further than that. He's super into this. Like this is all of his shit really bends on the master signifier concept. So yes, the answer is yes. Obviously, the answer is yes.
You're saying that like Nietzsche and that's what Deleuze is grabbing on, that Lacan is not radical enough to go beyond this understanding, right?
That's the phrase that they use earlier. Is Lacan took the pylons of Oedipus and planted dynamite and blew it up, only to have it fall right back in position, because the damage he did ultimately just hardens the position and makes it more difficult to take it down the next time. And that's if you read Guattari's work consistently, that's his attack on Lacan. He's a lot more vitriolic, I think, than Deleuze is, but his attack is consistently, hey, look, you did some great shit, but holy fuck, you really made this stuff like way more hardcore, and you didn't really free anything. And given their critique throughout the rest of this, as we make our way to Capital, I think it's a hell of a strong critique. One I happen to agree with. What can I say? It applies to late Lacan as well. I don't even. That's
So
a
would
great
you say
question.
that
I don't know.
Yeah, would you say that Nietzsche and Foucault are, not just describing the history of punishment and the despotic, but they're critiquing it, right?
Oh yes, I think they are personally. I think it's Foucault especially is doing critique, but Foucault ultimately, it's one of his things. He always said he hated Anti-Oedipus, and he never really got it, because to him lack is the baseline. He was very much in line with sort of the linguistic understanding that the master signifier and lack was built in, that there's a negative that creates. It's a very Hegelian sort of view of things, despite Foucault and the rest of his work. For Deleuze, lack doesn't exist. Lack is not the primordial. Desire is. And lack is produced affirmatively through these interactions, and is actually a thing that is then produced. So it's a different take in a wide margin. Nietzsche, I think I'm going to sidestep that, because I'm not good enough to be able to state strongly. But yeah. But Bats, I don't have an answer for your question, Bats. I'm sorry. Jack,
Yeah.
go for it.
Are you familiar with Hegel? Would you interpret Hegel's negative negation as a kind of a lack?
Yes.
I think we're really getting beyond
I don't think so,
they're
but
talking about just about signifiers here, right? We're talking about like Hegel right now. I mean, I think we're way outside this paragraph.
I mean, okay.
Just trying to get a wider
I mean,
perspective.
the footnote from the previous paragraph literally talks about Hegel.
Yeah, but is it? I mean, yeah, okay.
I mean, again, you're right in the sense that we are going a little bit beyond. I do think this is where we start talking about the difference in how Deleuze and Guattari are talking about the construction of lack, the construction of the despotic signifier, the nature of the overcoding and deterritorialized despotic machine that works differently than what Lacan says or others have said. So I think there is some room there, but I think I grant your point, Jack. Please go for it. You've got a thing.
Well, I mean, there's not enough time for much of a thing at this point, because we're kind of over time. But I just wanted to say, like, to Remke's previous question, like, I tried to keep it Saussurian. I bypassed a lot of the D, almost the DGQC, the DG, like vocabulary for talking about it. I wrote it a little bit more fuller in the chat, so there's more of a sense of like how the syntheses play into that, as opposed to just trying to attack it from Saussure.
Yeah. This may be a thing that would be worth us doing a deeper dive, I think, another day, maybe end of this week. If anyone has time, I'll see if I do, because I think it's worth going into a little bit of Saussure, the nature of semiotics, how these things sort of operate, and how Deleuze and Guattari are running with it, because the line here, the one line I think that is really, really good to get with is alphabetical writing is not for illiterates, but by illiterates. It goes by way of illiterates, those unconscious workers. Okay. This is a lot of shit said here, but they're talking about sort of desiring machines. They're talking about this is not about sort of the conscious effort of things. That's the big thing that they're pushing for. This is not the conscious effort of things or the awareness of things or someone saying X, Y, and Z or like that setup. This is not the thing that they're talking about. Alphabetical writing is not for illiterates, but by illiterates. It goes by way of them, those unconscious workers. The signifier implies a language that overcodes another, while the other language is completely coded into phonetic elements. This is the Sumerian says the thing, the Akkadians speak it, they then speak it, it's phonetically coded into the written bit of the Sumerian. So now we have this really fucking weird interaction of these things. So this is the construction, the genealogy that they really want us to be getting at when we talk through the signifier and the signified. But again, the Saussurian sort of take on that is its own sort of thing. God damn, there's a lot we could go into here.
Yeah, I mean, we're even hitting in the chat. Like, what's really hard. So, I mean, to take the time to do this, you have to go through like 3 or 4 parallelisms they've set up. But like, basically, what they're trying to get at is how overcoding pertains to what's going on between the despotic and the earth more generally, right? Because overcoding is giving you this linguistic, so you're taking what's happening in Newman and then you're adding another dimension of it, right? And that's your overcoding. And by doing that, right, you're kind of taking the voice and the word, and I believe they're doing this through a parallelism with Saussure. Like you're adding to that a parallel by which the voice and the word, now you're dealing with them through the sign, right? And in so far as you're dealing with them through the sign, you're doing it through overcoding. And so far as you're not dealing with them in the sign, you're not dealing with them through overcoding, right? You're dealing with them encoding the way they were for the earth.
Yes.
And that's that stack that was the whole like theater of cruelty versus the pyramid of terror or whatever that we were talking about earlier. Like they're still outlining that point, but it's just a lot of parallels.
And it's And again, stuff like what Saussure ends up getting into is more graspable by us because the nature of our existence and how we see signs and interact with them. When we say, oh, look, I'm seeing a picture of an apple. This is the sign. The signified is the element within me that I am understanding that sign to be. The signifier is the actual apple that like I'm going to pick up. That interaction, I think we can grasp because we're already in this linguistic system. When we talk about it and we're going back further to the earth, for example, the way that signs operate, they use the example of the fertility gourd, the calabash that's tattooed on the body of a young woman as a symbol of fertility. It's not that it's about that being a gourd. It's not imitating a gourd. It's not a sign as we know it. It's not the effect of a signifier. But their quote is, it's a position and production of desire. Signs worked completely differently by being that position of desire. This sign, I'm just going to quote Holland here, the sign operates less in this case to convey a message. The woman does not learn the meaning of the ideograms during the initiation rite. It operates less to convey a message than to assign reproductive organs a place and a fruitful function within the group. Everyone henceforth knows to whom this womb belongs, or rather, what position it occupies in the network of alliances and filiations of the society, to whom its fruits will be due, along with pathways of debt and expenditure they'll have to circulate. This thing is able to be this polyvocal element because it's a position and production of desire. But now the gourd, which had this position, which existed in this odd triangulation that was relative and played relatively with these elements, now it has a hardline position because that sign has a word. That word has a meaning. And that meaning, what does it mean? You wouldn't ask that about a position of desire, a production of desire. You ask that about a sign. Sign because, holy fuck, that means something I have to learn. Because it means something to the despot, and the despot determines the language. It is now a determined language. So the signified is now a mental concept that the sign induces in me, and the signifier, the real thing of it. So this interaction completely shifts how we deal with all three elements. Or rather, how all three elements ultimately produce us and the meaning that sort of integrates all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not getting at us in our personal experience. It's getting at us in the conditions for experience, right? So I mean,
Yes.
this thing's a little the diagram I post's a little dubious because like the sign.
It's an
It's
oversimplified
really,
version, but it's close enough.
well, the bottom two parts are the sign is itself really more like the signifier and the signified, right? As opposed
Yes,
to
it's splitting the
what
difference.
what they labeled as the sign is really more it's actually the referent. What they labeled there, the
Yes.
sign is signifier plus signified.
Right, but I think it's okay at this point to have a simplistic version, because I think again, the more important thing is to understand how the signifier and signified are broken apart and how their determined meaning exists. Because again, the apple or the word apple, when you see that, what does the word apple mean? My daughter's 2, she's learning to read. My son's 6, learning to read very complicated words. What do these words mean? The idea of contextual clues is silly because these words have an exacting meaning that we've been given, and this is what we have to teach. Contextual clues doesn't teach people how to read properly or communicate in the way that we use language. So it's really this really wild way that we naturally, what does it mean? I take it in. Deleuze in Logic of Sense, I think, goes through very nicely this. Proust and Signs would be a really great dive if you're interested in that at all, because Proust and Signs is literally about this from Deleuze. So I'd recommend that. Both are in the server if you want to read them. But with that, I am going to, because we are way over, and I could literally go about this for the next like 3 hours because this is like the really fun shit. But I'm going to stop us here because it's been a while. Any last notes, Jack, before we bounce out?
Yeah, try to go back over this and understand those parallelisms if you have time. If
It's
you
worth
really
it.
want to get what they're getting at here.
I think that's a fair way to put it. Excellent. Well, thank all of you for joining us today. We will see you next week. This Thursday, we will be continuing our reading of Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, which is great. And I hope to do a couple more translation streams this week, which is nice and fun. So we'll see what we can get out there. And please.
Before I forget, yeah, we get the Kierkegaard's concept of dread starting Sunday too.
Oh
so.
shit, we've got Kierkegaard coming. I forgot.
Yeah, I got you and me both, but I remember today. Thought it was next week.
Fuck, that's gonna come up quick.
I'm not a good like host, man.
That's fine. That's fine. That's my job. So I'm gonna say, make sure to join us for Kierkegaard. And do your thing. And yes, on YouTube, hit likes and subs. Happy day. Otherwise, thank all of you for joining me. Highlight of my week, as always. And we'll see you next week as we dive even further into this. Keep an eye out somewhere on the server. We're going to post somewhere and say, do something Sasuri, sign signifier-y. Not sure what it'll be, but we'll try to do something this week because I think it's a worthwhile discussion for sure. It's a thing to grasp. So, thank you. We will talk